What's up, guys? Welcome to this week's episode of Best Bets for UFC Paris Imavov versus Borralho, where I'll be discussing the most confident picks, the lock of the week, the underdog of the week, and some parlays that I like. We've been going crazy with the lock of the weeks, where it's come through 4 weeks in a row now. We've had Kevin Vallejos dominating 3 rounds. We had Gabriela Fernandez dominating 3 rounds. Carlos Prates first round knockout, and Aljamain Sterling dominating for 5 rounds. So I'm hoping we can do the same thing this week. We'll make it 5 in a row. I know this week's lock of the week might be a bit risky in some people's eyes, but not mine. As always, I hope you're doing well. Hope you're having a great day. Let's dive into the most confident picks, where we got Modestas Bukauskas, Brad Tavares, and Mauricio Rufy. So starting off with Modestas Bukauskas on his second UFC run right now, he's 5-1. In his first UFC run in 2020, he went 1-3. He came back and he's been looking better than ever. When you take a look at his losses in his first UFC run and in his current UFC run, he's been losing to guys who are dangerous strikers. You know, he lost to Jimmy Crute, round one knockout. Khalil Roundtree kicked his kneecap out. Kicked his kneecap out of place. Vitor Petroni, who's a dangerous striker with serious knockout power, and I don't think he's gonna have that problem at all in this matchup versus Paul Craig. And as someone who's been looking really good in his striking recently, I see him dominating someone who isn't known for their striking at all. You know, we know that Paul Craig isn't a dangerous striker. Because Bukauskas, he brings fast, fluid striking and a diverse arsenal. You know, he has spinning kicks, roundhouse kicks, stance switches, and sharp feints. For a light heavyweight, he moves extremely well on his feet, and his grappling has steadily improved. You know, he's shown strong takedown defense throughout his career, including in this most recent fight. And on top of that, he'll have a 2-inch reach advantage over Paul Craig, and which further supports his striking advantage here. And so Modestas, he's clean. You know, he's a dangerous striker. He's capable of shutting the lights out of anyone with one shot. And while Craig has proven to be chinny, you know, at 31 years old, Bukauskas is in his prime, while Paul Craig is 37, well past his prime. Uh, his best years are behind him. Plus, Paul Craig has only won one fight in his past 7 fights, which isn't the greatest stat of all time. You know, Craig, he simply doesn't have the boxing to compete with Bukauskas on the feet, and his path to victory, Paul Craig's, lies on the ground. But everyone knows what he's looking for. You know, he wants to pull guard, he wants to work his submission game, and that game plan has become too predictable. You know, Modestas isn't reckless enough to dive into Paul Craig's ground game or into his guard, and he'll want the fight standing where he's the sharpest, and I think he'll be successful in keeping it there. You know, even if the fight does hit the mat, Craig's submission attempts are no longer a surprise. You know, they're expected, and Bukowskis has surely prepared for them. You know, and on the feet, Bukowski's speed, power, and technique, they're a huge advantage. You know, Paul Craig does use body kicks and high kicks effectively, but against a high level striker like Modestas Bukauskas, it's unlikely to be enough to get him the win, right? You know, I also don't see Craig easily closing the distance for takedowns. And even if he does get a takedown, it'll be tough to hold Modestas Bukauskas down or rack up any meaningful control time. You know, I think Modestas has multiple clear paths to victory here. You know, he can find a devastating knockout shot or simply outpoint Craig over those 3 rounds by landing the more convincing, accurate strikes and managing his distance and stuffing takedowns. His takedown defense has improved, and his grappling should let him keep this fight standing, where he can completely outstrike Craig from start to finish. You know, Bukowskis is riding strong momentum since rejoining the UFC. You know, he's won multiple fights, looking impressive in his victories, and he knows how to use his jab, his reach, his footwork to control the pace and the distance, and he can drain gas out of his opponents before delivering, you know, those finishing strikes. He's very adaptable and knows how to keep the fight where he wants it. So I just think Bukowskis, he's fast, he's fluid, he's a nice striker with solid takedown defense. Plus, he's in his prime at 31, coming up against Paul Craig, who's a guard-based grappler. You know, one win in his last 7. Plus, he's very chinny. It's a confident pick, and it has to be Modestas Bukauskas. He has a clear striking edge. He's going to stuff any takedown attempts, and the pick is Modestas Bukauskas. Moving on to our next most confident pick, we got Brad Tavares. Now, this isn't so much about Brad Tavares being good. Like, he is good. Don't get me wrong. He's a decent fighter. But it's more so about me really not admiring the skill level of his opponent. You know, Brad Tavares is a known fighter at this point. You know, he's a solid striker. Not elite, but skilled enough to compete with most in the middleweight division. You know, his takedown defense is excellent, 81%, and he's notoriously difficult to control. He's been in there with the very best, you know, losing only to top tier names like Dricus du Plessis, Israel Adesanya, Robert Whittaker, Yoel Romero, Gregory Rodriguez, and he does have some losses that haven't aged as well, but the majority were against championship level competition. And now he's facing Robert Bryczek, who only has one fight in the UFC, and he lost it, and it was against to Ihor Potieria. And that's arguably one of the worst loss you can have on your record, as Potieria is widely considered one of the weakest fighters on the roster. You know, if you're losing to him, it's hard to argue you belong in the UFC. And maybe it was his debut nerves is the reason why he lost to Ihor Potieria. But it doesn't matter. You know, comparing that with Tavares, who has 26 UFC fights and 16 wins, that's hard to argue that he belongs in a matchup like this with Brad Tavares. You know, Bryczek comes into this fight mainly as a striker with a history of quick finishes on the regional scene, but most of those wins were against low-level opponents, you know, older, unathletic fighters or guys with just terrible records. And when you're primarily a striker but losing to someone like Potieria, which is any striker's dream matchup, that's a big red flag, you know. And Robert Bryczek's striking, his striking defense is weak, you know. He eats a lot of leg kicks. His cardio beyond the first round is pretty much non-existent. Meanwhile, Tavares has built his career on durability, experience, and outpointing opponents over 3 rounds, you know. He may have to survive a fast start, you know, because Brad Tavares has been caught early by heavy hitters before, but Bryczek isn't on that level, in my opinion. You know, once Tavares finds his rhythm, he should manage distance, land his own leg kicks, and pile up clean technical shots. You know, as Bryczek starts to fade, Tavares' cardio advantage and experience will take over, allowing him to drown Bryczek and win clearly, most likely a decision. Because you have Tavares, 26 UFC fights in the UFC, who's a solid striker. Elite takedown defense, I don't think he's going to have to use that here, though, but he has the cardio for 3 rounds. Coming up against Bryczek, who lost his UFC debut to Ihor Potieria, has poor cardio past the first round. It's a confident pick. It has to be Brad Tavares. You know, I just think he's going to give Bryczek a veteran schooling here and picks him apart, most likely by a decision. And we have the lock of the week, Mauricio Rufy. I'm buying into the hype. You know, this has been somewhat controversial. You know, I see a lot of people picking Benoit Saint-Denis, but personally, I think Rufy will be able to dominate in this matchup. You know, so much to the point where I'm making him lock of the week. You know, he has both elite power and timing, plus the kind of explosive striking that finishes fights with landing the right shot, while BSD gets hit often. You know, I don't see myself picking against Mauricio Rufy anytime soon. You know, he's looked better every time he steps into the octagon. And his last fight against Bobby Green, I mean, that was absolutely flawless. Now, he is taking a step up in competition, facing a ranked French opponent in France, which makes this matchup even more exciting. You know, I've been on Mauricio Rufy since his debut. You know, his win over Lomtop and again versus Bobby Green, and he hasn't let me down. You know, he's consistent, he's entertaining, and fights with that prime McGregor vibe. You know, when he wins, it feels big. And this time he's up against Benoit Saint-Denis, a fighter who has struggled against high-level opponents. You know, he was dominated by Renato Moicano, finished by Dustin Poirier, and lost his UFC debut to Zaleski dos Santos. Now he has to face someone as dangerous as Rufy. Anytime you get an athlete with Rufy's skill set, you know Rufy's able of taking over the fight. You know, BSD will likely rely on his grappling in this matchup because standing with Rufy is like playing with fire. But BSD, he's aggressive, he likes to push forward and often uses his striking to set up those takedowns. But that's exactly where Ruffy is going to shine. He manages distance perfectly. He uses his footwork to stay elusive, out of the way, and punishes openings with sharp, accurate counters. Those moments when BSD tries to close the gap will be the most dangerous moments for him because Ruffy will be tagging him on the way in. So Marisa Rufi, lock of the week. We've seen uh BSD's chin crack before. Like, I'm making Ruffy the lock of the week, and when he wins, that will be 5 weeks in a row where lock of the week has come through. Um, because yeah, like I said, we've seen BSD's chin crack before. He's hittable, and we've seen him fade under heavy fire. Poirier survived an early takedown and then finished him, and Moicano dominated him on the ground. And Ruffy has the tools to do the same, whether by stuffing takedowns with his 100% takedown defense so far in the UFC, or punishing Benoit Saint Denis every time he tries to come close to close the distance. So even if BSD does manage to drag him down, it won't be without taking some serious damage at first. Enough damage so that Mauricio would have won the round already. So this is the best grappler Rufi has faced. So there are still questions about how his defensive wrestling will hold up, but given how sharp his and dangerous his he is on the feet, combined with his proven composure and ability to find those clean shots, I believe he'll be patient, pick his openings, find his openings, and eventually put BSD away. Because, Maurice Rufi, he's a rising star right now, elite striking, 100% takedown defense, and just been having flawless performances. And coming up against BSD, who's an aggressive grappler, I just think BSD is too hittable, and his chin has been tested already by elite competition. So, lock of the week is Mauricio Rufi. I just think he's too sharp. He's going to stuff the takedowns and find that knockout shot. Moving on to underdog of the week, we got Balaji Oki. In my opinion, Balaji Oki has some of the cleanest striking in the division. He's calm, he's composed, and he's patient. He waits for the right moment to snap forward at you like a cobra with precise shots, then quickly resetting behind his guard. He doesn't allow himself to get too reckless, and he applies pressure without being reckless, breaking down his opponents with steady forward movement. She has sharp hands and a smart shot selection. It says he's plus 165 right now, but last time I checked, not too long ago, he's gone down to plus 120, 125 already. So I'm sensing that people are sensing the same thing. That one blemish on his record with the Chris Duncan fight, where he was winning the striking exchanges, but made the mistake of shooting a takedown and then gets caught in the guillotine. That looked more like a learning experience than anything. He bounced back with a strong win over Michael Aswell, where he pushed the pace, worked the body, and landed crisp right hands to overwhelm a very tough opponent throughout the fight. And now he's fighting Mason Jones, who also pressures forward. He mixes in takedowns more often than Balaji, and Mason Jones does carry excellent cardio. Jones is a more well-rounded fighter on paper, with boxing and jiu-jitsu to complement his wrestling. But if this fight plays out mostly on the feet, and it likely will, I just think Oki's boxing is a little bit sharper. He makes opponents uncomfortable with his striking pressure, and I expect him to do the same thing here. Jones, he'll be throwing leg kicks and try to keep up in the exchanges, but I think Jones is hittable. I see him eating clean shots throughout the fight, which may push him to try to use his wrestling later in the fight. And Oki's going to know that. He's going to sense that. And Oki has shown to adapt, using his distance striking to defend takedowns if needed. I don't think Mason Jones will simply out-grapple Oki, not against someone this composed and defensively aware. Plus, Oki's ground game, I would say, is underrated. Like, he has great takedown defense for the most part. And I just think Oki, he's a patient sniper, sharp boxing, and he just has that dangerous pressure, which I like to see. Coming up against Jones, he is a pressure boxer wrestler, but I think he's hittable. And I think Balaji Oki's striking style will match up nicely against Jones, who's he is hittable. Plus, he has weaker defense, and the pick has to be Borralho. You know, I think he's going to land the cleaner shots, and he's going to be able to adapt to Mason Jones's pace. Moving on to our next section, we got the parlays section. Guys, these top three parlays, I'm equally confident in them. You know, they really all can be considered the safety lock, in my opinion. These top three, equally confident in them. I just put them in this order based off of the odds getting better. You know, but I think I'm equally confident in these top three equally. You know, moving on, let's get into the first one. Safety lock. Really, the top three, they're all safety locks in my opinion. Brad Tavares and Modestas Bukauskas. You know, you have Tavares, like I said, he has that veteran skill within him. You know, he has the elite takedown defense, 81%, very durable, and he has proven cardio. I think he's a perfect matchup for someone like Robert Bryczek, who lost his debut to Ihor Pretoria and has poor defense and has poor cardio. Pairing that up with Modestas Bukauskas, who's younger, faster, sharper striker against an aging Paul Craig, whose game is one-dimensional, which is pulling guard for submissions. Modestas is disciplined enough to avoid that trap and win this fight standing up. It works because both guys are experienced, defensively responsible, and matched against opponents with huge flaws. I think it's a very safe two-leg anchor. Moving on to our next parlay, we got the ultimate lock. Mauricio Rufy plus Gomis Ruchala over 2.5. You already know Rufy, the lock of the week. He's a red hot prospect, been looking flawless, elite striking, and he looks like a future star. Against Saint Denis, his takedown defense and sharp accuracy, I believe, will give him the edge. And you got the over 2.5 in the Gomis Ruchala. Both fighters here are grinders who prefer longer fights. Gomis likes to mix in the wrestling and goes to a decision more often than not. You know, Gomis has gone to a decision in 4 out of his 5 UFC fights. And the one that didn't go the distance ended in the 3rd round. So, you know, Ruchala is tough and durable. Finish here is unlikely. It will most likely be a decision. And it works because you're pairing an exciting, high confident favorite, in my opinion, with historically reliable over 2.5, which creates a balanced plus money lock. Moving on to our affordable juice section, you know, pairing up the lock of the week with Brad Tavares. You already know Rufy, clear striking advantage, momentum, and consistency coming up against a hittable opponent. Pairing him up with Tavares, safe veteran pick against a debuting level opponent who's looked unimpressive in his debut. And it just works. You have one surging prospect with one reliable veteran, you know. So it's a clean parlay. Good way to get some juicy odds and still keep the confidence high. Moving on to our next parlay, we got the most confident picks parlay, where you're pairing up the trio: Mauricio Rufy, Brad Tavares, Modestas Bukauskas. You know, Rufy, he's got the prospect momentum. Tavares, the safe veteran. Bukauskas, prime striker versus an aging one-dimensional grappler. These are the 3 most confident straight picks on the card. You know, bundling them together gets you nearly plus 200 without needing any of those risky props. You know, they're the most confident picks. I think they come through for plus 200 nearly. You know, those are great odds for only 3 picks, the most confident picks, you know. Moving on to our next parlay, we got Mauricio Rufy plus Balaji Oki plus 275. I'm calling it an easy workout. It might be a bit of a sweat with the Oki fight, but you know, you already know Rufy, high confident pick. He's the lock of the week. Pairing him up with Oki, one of the sharpest underdogs on the card, in my opinion. You know, he's got crisp boxing, brings strong pressure, and I feel like he's improving every fight. I just think he matches up well versus Mason Jones, and he can steal rounds with that sharp output and forward pressure and that boxing style that he has. You know, you're combining a trusted anchor with an underdog that has a clear stylistic advantage, in my opinion. You know, they both do. If Ogi pulls it off, you're getting solid plus money on this. Excuse me. Um, Moving on to our underdog city parlay, Balaji Oki and Borralho Imavov over 4.5 at plus 320. You know, you got you got Oki, dangerous underdog, strong pressure striker. Pairing it up with the over 4.5 Borralho Imavov, I feel like they are both of these fighters are technical middleweights who tend to fight safe at range. Neither is reckless, and this just screams decision. You know, you got great value in a dog plus a high probability in an over 2.5 in a technical main event. Pairing the underdog of the week with a steady decision likely matchup, I feel it hits, especially at plus 320. So moving on to our last underdog city part 2 right here. You know, I'm pairing up Balaji Oki and Andreas Gustafsson. Oki, you already explained above, you know, he's the live dog with a striking advantage in my opinion. Pairing him up with Andreas Gustafsson, you know, Gustafsson was the underdog, but I believe now he's starting to become more of a favorite. But you pair him up with Oki, that's plus 380. You know, Gustafsson, he's a durable, gritty fighter coming off of strong performances. You know, he matches up well with Fakhretdinov, who can slow down if he's forced to work. And we know that Gustafsson is going to make him work. You know, it works because both dogs have legit paths to victory, and neither is a puncher's chance only type of underdog. You know, they both really could win at nearly plus 400. I think it's a great sprinkle. And that concludes the best bets. That's the card, and those are my best bets for the week. And remember, bet smart and don't chase any losses. Let me know if you found this helpful. You know, I've been cooking with the past 4 lock of the weeks, and hopefully Mauricio Rufy comes through. Many people are on Benoit Saint Denis, but I don't see it. We're making it 5 in a row this week when Mauricio Rufy wins. You know, so drop your picks in the comments. I want to hear who you're rolling with. Anyways, that's it for me. Have a great day. Take care of yourselves. Love you guys. Good luck. I'm out. Peace.